Professor, pleasure to speak to you. How are you?
Very well.
So I've been saying for a while that I think the war's going to end, and I've been saying recently since the ceasefire, I'm saying the ceasefire will hold. And the main reasoning for this is I think both sides want the war to end. The Iranians just don't want their commanders to continue getting killed and their country getting bombed. And on the American side, the main factor that Trump's paying attention to is the economy. And that's why I'm really excited to speak to someone like yourself. Obviously, a lot of people smarter than me disagree with me. You know, they believe that the war is not over. Hopefully, I'm right. But on the economy, which I think is the factor that not enough people talk about. My question first will be, what are the economic ramifications of this war if it ends today, if it's already ended? Because it will take a long time for the global economy to adjust and go back to where it is. I think people don't understand the disruption that the economy has faced. And secondly, so it's a two-part question, take your time in answering.
Yeah.
Secondly is, what happens if the war continues for another 3 months?
Yeah. Well, if the war ends today, there's still something like, a 6-week hole in the distribution of goods and services coming through the Straits of Hormuz. And that means that there's, because we have so much manufacturing is based on just-in-time concepts these days, firms don't have large stocks on hand. So if they run out of essential supplies in a 6 weeks period, then they can't produce anything for 6 weeks. Now, that, of course, let's say you've got firms with a 4-week buffer, okay, of the inputs they need, and they've got 6 weeks to wait. There's going to be a 2-week hole, no matter what you do. That's going to damage production processes all around the planet when they depend upon goods that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And obviously, we know oil does, and that's going to be a critical hole in the energy supplies for the entire planet, which is an issue in its own right. But also, we have essential commodities like helium, which is vital for high-tech manufacturing processes, sulfuric acid, which is vital for virtually every manufacturing process. Certainly, it's vital for smelting copper, and fertilizer. And if we don't have enough fertilizer, then we can't produce a food output. And that is absolutely critical, because if you can't feed people, if people start to starve for an absence of food because of the absence of fertilizer at the critical time needed for harvests, then we're going to have all sorts of chaos over the planet, something we haven't really experienced in this scale before. So I think it's extremely serious. And if people are just thinking in terms of the oil price, they're drastically underestimating the damage this is going to do if the war ends today. Now, if it continues on, then we lose about 1/3 of the world's energy supplies, roughly speaking. There's all the energy comes in multiple forms, obviously, but oil and liquid natural gas are two absolutely critical elements of that for so many economies. I mean, just for a bare bones example, if the liquid natural gas runs out, I can't cook anymore on my LNG stove. So there are so many elements of our production system which depend upon energy. And if you cut energy out, basically every 1% fall in energy translates to a 1% fall in GDP. Now, if we see even just 10% in terms of the aggregate impact of cutting off the Strait of Hormuz, a 10% fall in energy supplies implies a 10% fall in GDP.
Oh. Yeah. All right, so let's go back to if the best case scenario that it ends now. And I like how you talked about the just-in-time scenario. So for people that don't listen, I remember that was like the cool thing that came up many years ago, and then I think that all the companies were implementing it, and the companies that had just-in-time logistics or supply had an edge over competitors because it was a lot less capital intensive, and that's having as little supply, as little stock as possible in your inventory. And I remember in my companies, we were doing the same thing. We still do the same thing. In COVID, it bit us in the ass, but having as little inventory as possible, because this way, first, again, not a lot of capital is locked up in inventory. And if you need to launch a new product or sales drop, etc., you're not stuck with a lot of stock. But that just-in-time concept depended on globalization working, and for globalization to work as a concept, it depends. it suffers when things like COVID happen, or things like this war, which is a black swan event, something that no one expected. Which I just
I'll
consider to
agree.
be,
There's definitely black swan.
yeah, exactly, a very black swan. Like, this is the definition of a black swan event. So you're talking about the helium oil, the fertilizers, the LNG that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. So why the market seem to be pricing in an end to the war based on what we're seeing, but they don't seem to be pricing in the long-term impact of this war.
No, look, I had a session on another ex-discussion forum about 4 or 5 days ago, and it was me and about half a dozen people who work in finance markets talking about the impact of the war. And frankly, I just got bored, and I gave my piece and I left, because it was obvious none of them had any concept of the physical ramifications of this war. It was all about the impact on the oil price, as if price is the only thing that's going to be varied courtesy of the war. No, it's the quantity that's being drastically slashed. And because people who work in finance have no understanding of how production actually occurs, the physical side of production, they're not engineers, they're not process workers. They're people who are divorced from the nuts and bolts of making goods and services and dwell entirely in the realm of what's the value of this share? Do we expect the price to rise over time or not? They're completely divorced from the production system. Now, if you had people staffing those desks who are engineers, they'd be screaming bloody murder, because they know that if you cut off the energy, you can't turn the machines on. They know if you haven't got the helium, you can't do the very fine scientific controls we use for manufacturing processes these days. You certainly can't make microchips. All these things stop. And it is effectively, it's like taking a blade and slashing through the economy and hitting numerous different spots. That you take them out and then telling this rest of the system to survive. It's the classic. If you would know one thing from Arabic history, there was this tale of the death of 1,000 cuts. Okay, you didn't get executed; you got cut 1,000 times, and you slowly dysfunctioned and bled to death. That's this experience is like, and there has never been anything like it in human history before, because no leader has been stupid enough to cut off the production, a critical part of the production system of the entire planet with just one conflict. But Donald Trump's managed to do it.
Before we go into what happens to the global economy if the war continues, because he kind of gave us a glimpse into that, where's the miscalculation there? Like, without putting Trump in a bucket of like the president is insane, which I just think is an oversimplification, without putting it in a bucket that Israel calls the shots, which I think they have too much influence over American politics, but I don't think it's as easy as calling the shots like, Trump, we need you to attack Iran. I think it's multiple reasons that led Trump over the edge. But the one that I'm most interested in is, how come he didn't know about the economic ramifications? Because the economic ramifications is why he had to end the war sooner than he would have liked, when he did not achieve a strategic win. If anything, he achieved a strategic loss, a significant one that will be felt for generations to come. But what did he get wrong? Was it Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz? Was it the global economy's resilience to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? Because everyone I spoke to before this war, Professor, everybody, very pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-US, pro-Iran, everyone agreed that the Strait of Hormuz closure would be catastrophic for the global economy. And surprise, surprise, it is.
I mean, I'm never going to accuse Trump of being intelligent or understanding the consequences of his actions. So I think there is a certain amount of truth. He sold a bad bill of goods by Netanyahu and went ahead with it despite the advice of his advisors. We certainly we won't know until we get the recordings of the White House, just what the conversations are like inside that madhouse once Trump is gone, if ever that happens. But I think we'll find, appalling ignorance, self-confidence, all those sorts of things leading to those sorts of decisions. But I think a major reason why you need advisors who know what they're talking about. And if you have advisors who are mainstream economists, then they're not going to know what they're talking about, because as it happens, the model that economists use to mathematically say what causes production leaves out energy completely. In fact, it leaves out the physical world. They argue you can put labour and capital and technology together in a factory and produce output. It's called the Cobb-Douglas production function. It's become the default way that economists model production, but it completely leaves out the need for inputs from the natural world. Now, this wasn't always the case. There was a time when economists learnt what are called computable general equilibrium models, and they actually looked at input-output dynamics. And if they said, now cut out 10% of energy, you're going to hit all these other 99 industries really badly. That level of awareness is not there. So without people who understand the physical nature of production advising Trump, they don't necessarily know what you and your friends have told you about how critical that particular strait is. You have to know, for example, that hydrogen sulfide is a byproduct of mining oil, and that hydrogen sulfide is an essential input to make sulfuric acid. You need to know that helium is caught in oil wells because it gets trapped in the same geological formations that trap the oil. All these things take a physical understanding of the real world, and unfortunately most economic advisors are devoid of that. So they wouldn't have been able to warn Trump sufficiently to stop him making this stupid decision.
Yeah. By the way, there's good news that Iran, the markets are just picked up again. They're in the green. They've reversed all the losses. I'm talking about the Dow. After Iran confirmed they will be attending the negotiations, and there's talks, a lot of indications of a potential power struggle in Iran. I'm going to be posting about it very soon, doing a tweet explaining it. You've seen those indications as well, because you've got the president saying, look, the war needs to end. It's disastrous for the Iranian economy. He made those statements earlier today. But you've also got Arachi and Ghalibaf, the executive branch members that the U.S. administration likes. They seem to be worried about the more hardline members of the IRGC wanting to sabotage the negotiations, probably because they have very maximalist demands. So we are, and now Trump is talking about regime change. He just did a post now talking about regime change and having a new regime. So I don't know if there's a power struggle in Iran and whether the U.S. is trying to empower the executive branch.
The place being in a power struggle in is the White House.
You think so?
Yeah. Look, I think one thing which has come out of this conflict is how, despite the fact that there might be a religious group that, the religiously run theocracy stroke political system in Iran, I think everybody's been impressed with the level of intelligence and preparedness that the Iranians have shown in this conflict, and the breadth of knowledge of the people who are negotiating on their behalf. It's quite remarkable. We didn't know any of this before the conflict. If any country's external image have risen over this whole crisis, it's been Iran. The opposite can be said for America. It's a total, it's a cluster FUCK coming out of America. And if you're going to see regime change to stop this war, forget about seeing it in Iran. You need it in America, because I think as soon as Trump ceased being in control, as soon as Hexgathic is also disabled, the war will end.
I agree with your point about Iran. Iran has shown a lot of pragmatism, but again, Iran, I think, is not just one sole decision maker, one body that's making the decisions. In the US, it's at least President Trump. He's got different people that have his ear and who has more influence. I think that shifts. Before the war, it seems that the donors and the people in Mar-a-Lago had his ear more than the people in the White House that would have been the advisors to listen to. And now I think he's going to shift. I think he's gonna, my guess, and I've been saying this for about a week, is that I think he's going to lash out at Netanyahu. I think he's really upset. He's been misled into this war, which has been catastrophic for his legacy, catastrophic for the economy, catastrophic for him politically. I think, and I hope, for the sake of the U.S., the U.S. as a whole, I hope he does lash out, and that will be the beginning of a shift in American policy, and it's already happening among the polls. American foreign policy in relation to Israel, because I think I definitely would put a lot of blame on Israel for pushing Trump over the edge and selling him this war. Do you agree with my theory that the main reason for this war, because there must be a core reason for Trump to do this, where America benefits as well? Do you think in his mind he saw that this will be his opportunity to, he loves Iranian oil, to capture the Strait of Hormuz, which will be strategically very unachievable, unattainable as a goal. But if it does achieve it, again, not likely, but if in his mind, if he does achieve it, strategically, it gives the US a massive advantage over China. So from that sense, do you think that scenario also
Yeah,
played a
I
big
think
role in
in
this?
terms of if there's any intelligent realpolitik behind this stupid excursion, as he called it, then it comes down to wanting to control the world's oil supplies. Because when you think about America's growth into a political power, it was on the back of oil. It wasn't only oil, of course. I mean, one reason America became so successful, it's a huge continent between the Rockies and the Appalachians. You've got this enormous open plains. They wiped out the Indians, typical way the Americans deal with indigenous groups. But that gave this huge expansion of a enormous empire. China being much the same thing in that sense, a continental power, and that led them to become incredibly powerful. But it was all driven by oil, Standard Oil. Was the 1870s, was the beginning of the rise of American power. Now that they passed peak natural oil in about 1970 in America, they've only managed to extend their production using shale oil, but they're incredibly aware of how dependent they are upon oil supplies. Now, shale oil runs out extremely rapidly. It's a very labor and capital intensive industry to keep them going. The oil wells in Venezuela and in Iran and in the Middle East, even though they're being depleted, there's a more reliable supply than what America is getting out of fracking. So I've got a feeling a large part of the what do you call it, the term that Trump uses as abuse, the deep state. The deep state was looking at controlling all the world's oil supplies. Yeah. And so that's part of it, including intimidating Russia. And they also, they can't handle the thought that they're going to be outdone by another country, let alone China. So the ways of trying to cripple China, this is part of that same strategy as well. But I think it's a bit like watching the barbarians take on the Han Chinese. I think the clumsy way in which America has done this is just breathtakingly bad. And the Chinese will be preparing to cover for it in their own engineering and methodical way they approach these things, putting in new oil pipes, connecting them to Iran, putting them underground that they can't be bombed. They'll do all sorts of things to evade what America's trying to do by force.
That's what really perplexes me about this war. It didn't take someone with access to classified briefings and intelligence reports to know the basics that Iran's been preparing for this war for decades. Iran has manufacturing capabilities on the ground. Iran is war gamed and prepared for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz as their main point of leverage, as Medvedev calls it, their nuclear weapon for for decades. So Iran was very prepared for this, and they've warned that they would do this. So again, it just perplexes me why Trump got into this war. But it's another discussion. He did put out a post now while we're speaking. Israel never talked me into the war with Iran. The result of October 7th, added to my lifelong opinion that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, did. I watch and read fake news pundits and polls in total disbelief. 90% of what they say are lies and made up stories, and the polls are rigged, much as the 2020 presidential election was rigged. Just like the results in Venezuela, which the media doesn't like talking about, the results in Iran will be amazing. And if Iran's new leaders, regime change, are smart, Iran can have a great and prosperous future. Interesting. So he literally just posted.
He's imagining putting up a Trump Tower in Tehran. The guy's delusional. Sorry.
What do you make of the post? Him?
The guy's cracked. He's mad.
Why would he put a post saying that? Sorry, go ahead. I was saying, why would he say a post saying
because he's mad. Okay. Let's go through it. He's got narcissistic personality disorder. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to diagnose that. In his he's an archetypal example of it. He's malignant. He enjoys inflicting pain upon other people. He's been a real estate con man throughout his entire career, about 30 bloody bankruptcies he's had so far. He will contract somebody to do a building and give them a contracted price and negotiate a contracted price and then pay them half that amount and say, so go and sue me. This is in real estate replayed at the global level. So it's not hard to understand when you know how he's made his mark, if not his fortune, in real estate and casinos in New York.
It's just odd. Israel never talked me into the war with Iran. I think he's just bringing more attention to Israel being behind the reason.
Exactly. This is, I mean, again, I'm a PhD in economics, not in medicine, but I'm reading a number of people who are writing about this and saying malignant narcissism obviously being displayed, but also frontal lobe dementia. And that's meaning he no longer has the control mechanisms to stop him doing something stupid. I mean, we've all, you get too drunk, too stoned, whatever else, your control mechanisms disappear, you do something you regret, and then you recover and you try not to do the behavior again, or you're aware of the circumstances. But if your brain is actually breaking down in the segments of it that control your most irresponsible behaviors, they come to the fore. There's no filter anymore. What you're reading is the unfiltered ravings of a madman. And the fact that America has no simple way to remove him is tragic. And they're defending themselves. They're saying, we've got this wonderful constitution. The constitution's provisions were never designed for somebody like Trump, who's got exclusive and unilateral access to nuclear codes. So I think the only way this is resolved is if somebody in the military ultimately blocks what I think Trump is finally going to say. And I've seen this commented, you never know these things are true of, not particularly post-AI, but comments from somebody saying a source inside the Pentagon told them that the leading general stormed out of a meeting because apparently Trump asked for the nuclear codes. Now, this is, I mean, it might not happen. This may all be exaggeration. It's feasible that this is just intimidation that he's playing out anyway. But what on earth are we doing, letting somebody with his mental problems have unilateral capacity to launch nuclear weapons? And this is beyond anything about respect for the Constitution. Let's respect human life and say this guy's the biggest threat to human life on the planet. He has to be taken out of the decision-making chain for America, however that is done. I think that's absolutely critical because he's only going to get worse. I mean, the narcissism is the ground level. The dementia is the mountain of madness he's building, and that'll just get worse as time goes on.
You really have those concerns? You're really that worried about his mental state? Because would you give him credit for walking out of the war when everyone was pressuring him not to? He talked about ending a civilization, destroying Iran, destroying their infrastructure, and then, well, like, how do you differentiate between? I apologize. The madman theory approach that Nixon coined, where you'd want the opponent to think you're a madman, so then they concede, versus him genuinely being a madman, like Tucker Carlson, for example, is really worried about the nuclear codes. So how do you differentiate between the two?
Okay, it's the malignant side of his personality means he lacks empathy. So he's quite capable of being involved in a business deal and actually celebrating the fact that he screwed the other side of the business deal. He's transferred that same behavior over to being president without necessarily having to be insane and without dementia. Now you're adding the mental problem he has, which is narcissism and malignant narcissism and dementia on top of that. It's just it's the sort of mixture that I don't want to be discussing to find that he does press that button. He's part mad, he's part cunning. He's using this as a pump and dump scheme. That's fairly obvious. The statistics that are turning up with sudden trades 15 minutes before his tweet. Take a look on the market and see if there have been big trades. Right. 15 minutes before that last tweet.
But it could be someone that has access to the information, well, not him personally, someone within the administration.
Yeah, I'm not saying he's actually the one buying the shares. I'm not saying he's doing the pump and dump himself, but he has what he calls friends. He has what he calls offspring. It's potentially somebody who's getting the information out from him in advance. And bang, they're prepared. And then when the market is going to go up, they're positioned to buy. When it's going to go down, they've already sold. There are enormous amounts of money being made out of manipulating this market. So partially he's doing that crazy stuff to push the market and push it as far as he possibly can to get the biggest possible swings to exploit that pump and dump scheme. But partly also, if he gets to the point where he simply realizes he's on his way to jail, if that actually dawns on him, or if he's on a way to the most humiliating defeat in the history of American politics, if it gets to the the midterms, then he may well just press the crazy button. And that's the thing. I think we simply shouldn't be living on tenterhooks, hoping that somebody who's cracked and cornered isn't going to do something insane.
I want to give you my theory that I posted a few days ago. So just so you know my position, I'm extremely critical of the war. And when it comes to President Trump, I'm critical of some policies, supportive of others. So it just depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about free speech, I've supported. If we're talking about his
free
approach
speech. It's a part of me laughing there.
Less so now. No, less so now. Yeah, less so now. Yeah, less so now.
I'm not going to go to America because I don't want to get arrested and find myself in an El Salvadorian jail. That's how free speech is in America right now. I know hundreds of people in Europe who absolutely refuse to go to America right now because of free speech.
What policies are they worried about? Because
being arrested by somebody at customs, and they check your phone. I mean, I've never gone through America before and had somebody check my social media posts for the last 5 years. That's one of the new requirements. Okay, all this stuff means that anybody with any intelligence who's got any critical thoughts about Trump at all is risking imprisonment if they try to go to America and get caught I'll use an Australian expression, a dead shit in the customs queue. Okay, you don't want to take the risk. So his freedom anyway. You keep on going. Freedom of speech. Yep. Okay. Right. Yep.
I'm going to go through the theory on the Iran war. And I said, so on the Iran war, I'm very, very critical. I think it's a very stupid war, very silly decision. Yeah. It really bothered me of a decision. It just made no sense whatsoever. Like, I praise him when it comes to Ukraine war. I praise him not on ending it. I think him saying he's going to end it in 24 hours is just political rhetoric. But at least trying. Under Biden, there were not even any rapprochement between the US and Russia. Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin was considered, kind of blasphemous in the US. And now Europe is talking to Putin. So I think dialogue is a good thing when it comes to any two countries. And Iran, the complete opposite. That's why it came as a shock to me. But I made a post, and I've been very critical of the war. Now, I made a post a week ago, and I said the following. I said Trump could, and I want to get your thoughts on it, Professor. Trump could turn this still into a win for the US. Because right now it's a massive loss for the US. Iran, it's a bigger loss for Israel, but I think it's a big loss for the US. But depends on what happens next, and I'll explain. So if Trump first accepts strategic defeat, goes back home and politically labels it a win, and Iran needs to give him some political win,
which he will do. Yeah,
exactly, and he's good at doing.
Have you seen are you a Monty Python fan?
I'm not. No, I don't.
Yeah, okay. Well, so take a look at the Black Knight scene. Okay, in this case, Trump is the Black Knight. He's had 4 limbs cut off, and he still insists he's going to bite you to death. He will make a victory out of complete defeat. That's a good
look. That's a skill set of his, and if anything, it's a good thing in this war, because if he could fabricate a win, that means he doesn't really need to get a win on the battlefield. So for the war effort,
that's right.
Me, it's a good thing. Yeah. That's why I look at it as a good thing in this scenario. So I think if he goes back to the Oman offer and the Oman negotiations before this war started, the US had a great offer on the table, according to the Omanis and according to the Europeans. They didn't take that offer. Pisses me off, but it is what it is. So if he goes back and accepts an offer similar to that when it comes to their nuclear program, which apparently Iran is offering something similar again, according to the reports. Number 2, he accepts to unfreeze Iranian assets and lifts sanctions on Iran in return for Iran changing their foreign policy, especially when it comes to their proxy network. So not saying completely abandoning Hezbollah, etc., but changing their approach to them, and that depends on the new supreme leader, of not having the same destabilizing foreign policy and maybe focusing more domestically. So if they have a similar policy to other Gulf countries, which, they have their own proxy network, but it's not one of causing instability to increase their influence in the region, but it's one of increasing influence without necessarily, fighting Israel when it comes to Lebanon or causing havoc in Iraq. So if they change their foreign policy or their proxy network, the US would remove the sanctions on Iran, because the Iranian people have been suffering for decades because of these sanctions. So it'll be number 2, which I think are unnecessary. There's better ways of approaching this. Number 3 is to allow Iran some sort of toll booth at the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe if he's lucky, he gets a percentage of it, even though I think that's unlikely, for Iran to make up some of the reparations for the damages they've caused. Now, that will be disastrous for Israel, but that's the only way for Iran to be able to rebuild after this unnecessary war. And the last one is for Israel to pull out of Lebanon as Hezbollah dismantles. So that's like my scenario of how Trump can turn this disastrous mistake into a win long term. But do you agree with that scenario? That would be a win, and do you think it's feasible?
Well, I mean, those are basically Iran's terms from 3 or 4 weeks ago. So if he can paint those as a win, I'd be delighted. Okay, just end this damn thing before it does any more damage. I don't care. I mean, the story about somebody who's a narcissistic personality like Trump, they're not trying to convince the rest of the world. They're trying to convince themselves. So if he can spin it to his own head that this is a victory, and then he goes on to somewhere else, probably Cuba, at least it's not as critical for the global economy as what he's doing in the Strait of Hormuz. So I hope he does declare victory. He's going to. What's the old expression? You snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Well, that's what he's going to do.
Yeah.
He's going to call victory. Getting bitten by the jaws of defeat, he's going to call a victory. If he does that and stops the war, then I'm delighted. But I don't want a nutcase like him in control of American politics all the same, because what he's likely to do, and again seems to be, is influenced by lobby groups in America, the Israelis and also the Cuban exiles. Looks like he's going to invade Cuba. Now. But the only advantage of invading Cuba over invading the Strait of Hormuz is that Cuba, because it is not involved in any of the world's critical production processes, so it'll be Cuba's problem rather than the rest of the world's. But what he's doing with the Strait of Hormuz makes his decisions the rest of the world's problems.
By the way, Iranian media saying up until now, Iran's decision to not attend the talks hasn't changed. So there's multiple reports. They may attend, they may not attend. The US has already attended, but Iran is, we're getting a lot of messages. Iran is saying their media just saying now they won't be attending. And then just before that, PBS asked Trump, will Iran attend the talks in Islamabad? He said, I don't know, but they are supposed to be there. And then the reporter said, what if they don't? President Trump said, that's fine. If they do, that'll be great. If they don't, it will be great. So I feel like at the beginning of this war, I'd be putting all the blame on, obviously, the US for getting into this war, not Israel. The US made the decision.
Yeah.
Without the US, Israel would not be in this war. But I worry now an emboldened Iran, because they're emboldened by what they would consider a win, at least on the IRGC side. Now, I worry that an emboldened Iran would have a lot bigger ambitions now, a lot bigger demands, and they may be the ones to instigate this war. I did a post about 2 weeks ago. I said, Trump, the war began as the US being the aggressor and Iran being the victim. And but if Iran does not accept Trump's off-ramp, I think I did that just before the ceasefire, I posted that. Yeah. If Iran does not accept Trump's off-ramp, Iran is no longer the victim and becomes an aggressor as well. Both are aggressors now, because Iran, despite everything they've been through, they are in a position where they can get some pretty significant concessions from Trump. I'm not sure if you agree with that theory.
Well, look, the thing which Iran did, which we're all conscious of now, we didn't know before the war necessarily, was it broke its command structure in the military into 31 divisions, one for each of the internal provinces of Iran. And they also set it up a bit like a doomsday machine. I'm going to give you another movie you should watch if you haven't seen it yet, Dr. Strangelove. Have you seen that one?
I've wanted to. Okay. I haven't watched it yet. I wanted to.
Oh, okay. Give yourself a fun weekend of disaster movies and watch Dr. Strangelove. It's an absolute scream. You'll love it. But in that, with the part of the plot, and I'm not giving too much away to tell you, is that the Russian premier set up what's called a doomsday machine. And the doomsday machine, as soon as it picked up any sign of radiation, it would then dump the entire planet with radiation, kill all life on Earth. That's the doomsday switch. Now, and the thing is, you can't turn it off. Now, what the Persians have done, what the Iranians have done, is similar. If you behead them, then there's 31 other elements, the 31 heads of the Persian Hydra, all take their last set of orders, which is to basically conquer Israel. So I'm concerned that Israel seems to continue provoking Iran. When Trump made a peace settlement, they then bombed some of the civilian infrastructure at the time, and Trump came out and gave them an order. And that's one of the few times he seemed to lose his stack at Netanyahu. But the Israelis seem likely to continue provoking this because they expected to be able to dominate the region militarily. They're finding out the hard way that they don't. And I think the Iranians may have the capability to take Israel. Now, if you've done that, the doomsday switch by getting rid of the leadership, letting those 31 provinces have their own momentum, then they're going to continue in that direction. And that's the scary thing. There's no longer a group you can negotiate with the Iranians in the same sense that the Americans think they're doing, because it isn't just negotiating with the top leadership, it's getting the top leadership to turn off the doomsday machine that's already been activated by Trump's initial assassination of the original Ayatollah.
Yeah, I agree. We're talking about Israel. How much do you think they dictate when it comes to American foreign policy?
I think a hell of a lot. I mean, it goes beyond just what's happening with Iran. When I look at the behaviour of people like Starmer, the Australian Labor Party, the obsequiousness towards the Zionist lobby there, the whole story about Queensland banning the phrase "from the river to the sea." You've heard about that?
I saw that. That's quite, yeah. Is that after the shooting that happened?
Yeah. Because there's a John Farnham song, you probably know it, "From a river to the sea." There's a two strong hearts. It says, "We'll be together like the river to the sea, you and me." So Australians aren't allowed to sing a John Farnham song anymore. And it is ridiculous that the Starmer's behaviour.
That is crazy.
The only way I can make sense of it is to say that the Epstein operation was a Mossad sting that has incriminating information on numerous political leaders, and they're basically being told either do what we want or we'll expose you as a pederast or whatever else they've got files on. I just think that's the only way I can make sense of the sort of decisions that our so-called elite are making these days, when the populace has swung to be strongly and certainly anti-Zionist, and also I think largely anti-Israel. And that is a shift, that is a split between the populace and the leaders that has never really happened before. In the past, in most nations and Western nations, Israel has had the sympathetic position in the public as well as the leaders. Now there's an enormous gap. The leaders are still sympathetic and doing bizarre things, telling them, don't sing from a river to the sea. But the populace is angry about it, and it's a global phenomenon. So it is really hard to understand, except to say that a lot of people must have their balls in a vice, and the vice is called Epstein.
I'm hearing that a lot. I've covered Epstein extensively, and a lot of people are using that, and I don't blame them, as a way to explain the abnormality of this, because the polls speak for themselves. I was shocked to find out a few days ago, I was looking at the polls at an aggregator, and it said 35 to 55% of Americans believe in a one-state solution called Palestine. Americans from the age of 18 to 24. Age 18 to 24. I was pretty shocked, because I had a guest say it to me, an Iranian professor. I'm like, no way. I understand they might believe in a two-state solution, which the majority do. About 60% believe in a two-state solution. Yeah. But about 30 to 55% also believe in a one-state solution called Palestine. And only, I think it was like 5 to 15 or 10 to 15%. I think it's 5 to 15 believe in a one-state solution called Israel. And that's in the United States. Are we seeing, now I haven't been back home in Australia for many, many, many years. Are we seeing a similar shift there? Because I know Aussies, and I know how the mindset is there, and in Australia would hate being told what to do and what to say. So for the government to say you're not allowed to say, yes, how foolish are the government to ask them not to be able to say certain statements or make certain comments, and arrest people when they make those comments? It's just such an un-Australian thing to do. Is it already having backlash there? Are we seeing it in the polls in Australia as well, like in the US?
Yeah, I think it's widespread in Australia as well, probably stronger in Australia than in the United States, because Australia hasn't got that same history of the Zionist lobby spread through the entire country. And we do, and that's one thing which we like about Australia, the extent to which mateships and such extend across ethnic boundaries in a way that just doesn't seem to happen in America. But I know as a young man, I was converted to the Palestinian perspective on the crisis when I was 18 by talking to Lebanese friends of mine at Sydney University when I was doing my undergraduate degrees. So I was aware of that. At the same time, I had plenty of friends who were Israeli, and the whole sympathy for the Holocaust, coloured how you felt about events like the Yom Kippur War and so on. But it was a minority to be thinking that way about Palestine 50 years ago. Now it seems to be the majority position. So Israel has completely jeopardized its previous sympathetic stance in Western civilizations. And I think the major reason is Gaza. You cannot look at Gaza and say anything other than they're committing a genocide. And then if they're committing a genocide, how do we defend them? Because they were victims of a genocide. It becomes a crazy circularity, and people have finally said, no, what we have to stop is having decisions made on the basis of race inside different countries. And of course, the Israeli Knesset just recently passed a law that meant that Palestinians convicted of a particular level of crime are going to be executed, whereas Israelis will not. Pure racism.
Insane. Yeah, I think I made a post about it yesterday when there was a statue of Jesus that was struck by an Israeli soldier in South Lebanon. You saw that?
Yeah, I think I saw it.
Yeah, you saw the photo. Yeah, there was a photo of a statue, and it's been confirmed by the IDF. So obviously the actions of one soldier does not reflect an entire army. But we've seen that pattern happen time and time again. I started looking into the numbers. I did a post about it yesterday. And I think what led to this is just the level of impunity the country's has really benefited from for so many years, and that's because of the American system being so swayed in support of Israel, sometimes at the detriment of American foreign policy. And that's why I think this war, Professor, could change that. I really think that. I think Trump is, he obviously, it's not a lie, he's very pro-Israel since his first administration. He has, you know, the Adelson family and others, massive donors that are, you know, Zionists. So we know where his position is, but also know he does think for himself. And I think there's a limit to how far they can push. And I think they've crossed that limit. I think Netanyahu bit off more than he could chew. And I really think Trump is really pissed off at him. We'll see actions speak louder than words. So, but Trump did make a statement a couple of days ago. He's saying the US orders, or something along the lines of, we order Israelis not to fire or to abide by the ceasefire. I'm not sure if you saw that statement that Trump made. Or we prohibit Israel from striking Lebanon. Yeah, exactly.
It's a capitalized word and generally not capitalized post, which is quite unusual.
Exactly. And it kind of reminds me after the 12-day war when he said both sides don't know what the fuck they're doing. At the end of the 12-day war, when both sides were still striking each other, especially Israel was still striking Iran. But this time it's, I think the tide is shifting, not only when it comes to the poll numbers, not only when it comes to them biting off more than they can chew with Trump, but also Iran winning this war is going to lead to a massive power shift, a balance of power shift towards Iran. And that will lead to a lot of countries re-examining their alliances in the region, and Israel no longer being the hegemonist country in the region. And if America then pulls out their bases from the region, which is now being talked about, I think even the UAE, the former advisor to the president of the UAE, made a statement yesterday that he believes the US, it's time for the US to pull out of the UAE. And the UAE is one of the countries that's more supportive of the US administration. It just shows that we are seeing a pretty big shift in the region, politically, geopolitically in the region, more than Trump being pissed off or the polls showing sentiment change.
Look, I think the only way, if we're going to get peace in the Middle East, it actually goes back to one of the schisms in the Muslim religion, Sunnis versus Shiites. And that's not the entire background here, but of course, the Sunnis are the majority of Muslims around the world, but the Shiites are majority in Iran. And of course, you've got Arabs versus Persians as well, so there's all sorts of different divisions there. But that conflict between the Shia and the Sunni sects is a bit like the old days of the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics in the Christian religion. Now, the last time that actually exploded to anything on a geopolitical scale in the Catholic versus Protestant was the Northern Ireland conflict, of course. And ultimately, and this is something people have probably forgotten, Jerry O'Brien, who was the leader of the IRA, reached out for a rapprochement with, I've forgotten his name, but the extremely right-wing religious leader of the Catholics, and they became friends. And they also diffused that dispute. Now, the whole thought of Protestants versus Catholics these days in a conflict is a joke. It's historical. It's part of the past of the Catholic religion, the Christian religion. We need the same thing to happen inside the Muslim religion. And I think what happened with the Arab versus Persian and the Sunni versus Shiite sides, and also democratic, which Iran was democratic before the Americans deposed the Muqtadi and put the Shah in. It was democratic versus authoritarian principalities and kingdoms. Okay, so those are the various divisions. So the authoritarian principalities and kingdoms of the Sunni religion sided with America and Israel as a buffer against Shia Persia. Okay, now I think that has been shown to be an extremely bad bet, because they basically thought those bases were going to defend them against Iran, and in fact they were attacked by Iran when the war broke out, didn't defend any of the Arab facilities, and have now left. So they're realizing they backed the wrong horse. Now, I hope the only way to get reconciliation and make the Middle East stable would be for those different religions, sects of the same religion, to come together and say, let's make this a Muslim region, regardless of whether you're Shia or Sunni in the leadership. And also, of course, you need to foment something resembling democratic change in the Arabic states, because they're all dictatorships. And as you'd know from, I'm sure you've been there, 90% of the population are foreigners anyway.
I live in the UAE, so I live in the UAE.
You live in the UAE, you know what it's like, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody doing the work for you is a foreigner.
Yeah.
And it's a stratified society. It simply can't continue in that sense, being that way. It's unsustainable, because they're divided to be defended by Israel and America. That's fallen over. The only way for long-term peace to enable them to rebuild something resembling functional societies again is to make it a Muslim area, and then you keep out the Israelis and you keep out the Americans, and it becomes a Muslim area instead, and then you might get stability.
Yeah, I agree first. I think that the shift in the region, the realignment I told you about earlier, will be countries realizing the biggest threat is Israel. And I think that's something that's not being talked about enough. It started off with the Israeli strike in Qatar, started even before that, Israeli aggression across the region. Some of it was justified. People justified what happened in Gaza, not the extent of it. Most people are appalled by that. But they're like, Hamas committed that atrocities in Israel. Israel's responding. They responded in disproportionate ways, horrific ways. I'm starting to call it a genocide as well. But there was an explanation to it, at least. When it comes to Lebanon, Hezbollah attacked Israel. Israel responded. Hezbollah attacked them first. There was some sort of a justification as well. When it went to the Houthis as well, same thing. Where it started crossing the line is Syria. Al-Shara took power from Assad. Israel just pummeled the Syrian military, destroyed their capabilities in one of the heaviest bombing campaigns ever in the region, over a very limited period of time. And what happened is, even after that, Professor, they kept bombing Syria. Even a week or two ago, they're still bombing Syria, when the president is clearly trying to improve relations with Israel and neighboring countries to rebuild his country. Yeah. And then we saw the aggression towards Iran, and now they're really upset when they saw the strike in Qatar, an American ally. And then afterwards, a few months afterwards, dragging the US into a war, convincing Trump to launch a war against Iran, and dragging the entire Gulf region into that war. And then certain actions, Israeli actions throughout that period, the Israeli media saying the UAE is involved, or Israeli media trying to cause a rift between different Gulf countries. So a lot of Gulf countries are just seeing Israel more as a bigger and bigger threat. And then when you look at Netanyahu's comments saying, we're no longer a regional superpower, we're a global superpower now. If that cannot be perceived as a threat, that is
8 million people.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we will see that realignment. Now, I don't think it will go to the extent, and obviously it's impossible to tell what will happen in 20 years' time, where Israel will no longer be a state. I think Israel's here to stay, but Israel, with the impunity that it's always had, I think these days are numbered, and Israel will eventually have to change its entire foreign policy, its entire administration. The people will wake up that their approach to foreign policy is what's creating that cycle that results in violence against them, and that the cycle continues. When they go and level villages in Lebanon, well, people that don't support Hezbollah will then support Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is not leveling villages in Lebanon. They making stupid decisions and dragging Lebanon into a war. But it's Israel that's no longer just striking Hezbollah, but doing what they did in Gaza, doing it in Lebanon. So when these things happen, I think the region will wake up to the Israeli threat, and that's something that will take years to be felt, but that will be a result of this war in the last few years.
Yeah, I think of analogies with Japan's war in World War II, because one of the things that drove Japan into that war was America blockading its oil supplies. Okay, so but also Japan was a tiny country that took on giant-sized countries invading China. The rape of Nanking, the greater economic prosperity zone they tried to establish, all this sort of stuff, and they were humiliated and crushed by World War II. And as a result, you now talk about Japanese as the most polite people on the planet. The whole ethos of the society has turned upside down. So, like, I have one of my favorite people was my first girlfriend's father, who fought in World War II as a fighter pilot in Papua New Guinea. And he was the most wonderful, intelligent, empathic person you could ever hope to. But he said, but I'm never going to forgive those little yellow bastards. He could not forgive what he saw the Japanese do in Papua New Guinea. Okay, yeah. All the generosity of Solihull, that was just one step too far. Now, of course, the Japanese, you don't even think about Japan that way. It's become like a signpost for culture treatment. It's still xenophobic in various ways, but it's a cultured country. It treats people kindly, and that's become the attitude of Japan, but only after it was crushed. Now, there's a possibility the same thing applies for Israel, because I've had 3 trips to Israel. I've spoken with enough Israeli people. I know people who've been involved in high levels. I've been in Netanyahu's office, not when he was there, but that's one of the trips I made there to talk to his economic advisors. The level of racism in Israeli society towards Palestinians is overwhelming, and Arabs in general. And that is partly, it's because they're taught we're the chosen people. That's where it always comes out of religion. But it's also the fact they've been so successful in monstering that region for the last 50 or 60 years. Now, if they get crushed by Persia, in Iran in this case, then that suddenly they'll be taught humility. Now, I hope they don't learn humility without using nuclear weapons to see what they can do in the other direction. That's the other scary element of this crisis. But that racist, superior ethos that is part of Israel has to go as well. And that's probably harder than bringing about a 1 or 2 state solution.
That level of racism in Israel just perplexes me. Now, I was born Christian, but I've never really been religious, and I'm not religious now either. I'm not. You can call me atheist. I really don't think about it much, or agnostic. But for me, it's always been. I've never looked into the whole religious aspect of it, because I'm like, there is no way. There is no way religion dictates foreign policy. But since October 7th, it really.
Sorry, pardon me.
I learned that. Yeah, I learned it the hard way. I was just shocked and sad. It's sad to hear the statements by people like Mike Huckabee, and Ambassador, who I've had on the show, seeing his interview with Tucker Carlson, or Tucker Carlson talk about what did Mike Huckabee say? Didn't he say God's chosen people, and if they want the region, they can have it all? Like, when you make statements like this, now I'm not sure what he meant, and maybe he meant something else. But it's just like, what is the thinking process for someone to say that? For an ambassador, for a U.S. ambassador to Israel, it worries me, but I think we've reached the peak. I really do not. The numbers speak for themselves, and I think they've really pushed it too far after October 7th, and they really made decisions that benefited them short term. Short term, they're going to annex West Bank and Gaza, as heartbreaking as it is. They might even annex some Lebanese territory. They've managed to get rid of Assad. They've managed to degrade Hezbollah, destroy or degrade Hamas, destroy or degrade Houthis, and degrade the Iranian government, and have the U.S. bomb the hell out of the Iranian government and military for 40 days, something no president has done. So they've managed to achieve all this, but at what cost? In the short term, they've gained a few things. Long term, they've lost. Long term, they've lost.
I agree. Yeah.
As a final question, professors, going back to the question about the economy, because we got carried away, and it's a really fascinating discussion. I enjoyed this a lot. If the war continues, what happens? What would we, if Trump, for whatever reason, gets back into this war and makes me question everything I thought I knew about him? Wow.
There'll be a global famine. Okay, because fertilizer, 30% of the world's fertilizer passes through that strait. Now, people aren't aware of the extent to which we're reliant upon fertilizer, and fertilizer is an oil byproduct. We use, we have superphosphate, and we have the nitrogenous fertilizers, and they both require oil and oil derivatives to make those fertilizers. So 30% passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Now that's cut off for 6 months or so. This war, look, we've still got the bloody Ukraine war going. Or how was it, 4 years now? These things last far longer than you think they might. If it goes on for that length of time, we lose 30% of the food, of the fertilizer supply of the planet, and that implies a 30% fall in the population the planet can sustain. Because again, people aren't conscious of this, but the processes that create oil-based fertilizers have increased the carrying capacity of the planet from roughly 2 billion people with standard farming techniques to 9 billion with fertilizer. Now, if that fertilizer goes, that means we've got enough food for 6 billion people. That is a horrific thought about the potential level of death that could come out of this. I don't think it will be that bad, okay, but that's the potential we face. And the other crazy thing about it is that it isn't just countries of brown people who are going to have famines. That's the usual story. Famine in Africa, famine in India, give you a donation to the Freedom for Hungry campaign that I used to work for, this sort of thing. But what if Britain runs out of food? Now, Britain imports more than 40% of its food. It's got almost no stocks of fertilizer, doesn't make its own, very ineffective farming techniques. It's quite possible Britain could be told, I'm sorry, we're not going to sell you the food because we're keeping it for our own people. Yeah. You can have a famine in Britain. Now, that is the crazy world in which we currently live, courtesy of this war.
All countries that depend on globalization are screwed, starting with Europe.
Yeah, that's right. Globalization is dead. Like, I've been fighting globalization as a bad concept to begin with in terms of economic theory for my whole existence, but I never expected to see it get overturned this way. And a major part of this is that economic theory tells you, let's get efficient, let's focus upon efficiency. They never say, let's focus upon robustness. I think if the more efficient you make something, the less robust it is. Being a fellow Aussie, if you have to think, what's the world's least robust animal? What would you nominate? The world's least robust animal, the koala.
Oh, I was going to say the emu, but yeah, the koala's the worst.
The koalas eat about 20 of the 85 types of eucalyptus leaves. If those 20 trees die, they're gone. Okay? Now, you don't want to be a koala in a global economy, but when you make yourself dependent upon imports and you globalize everything and outsource everything, then you are critically dependent upon that system not changing, not breaking down. And here we have Trump going in the middle with a bloody sledgehammer. So we're now seeing how you've got to not just think about efficiency, but resilience as well. And that puts the kibosh in globalization.
Agree. Well, Professor, absolute pleasure for us to speak to a fellow Aussie. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been fun. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know you're Australian either. And secondly, to have a discussion, and not only on economic impact of this, but the political aspects of it. It was a really good back and forth. I really enjoyed it. So thank you, and I'd love to have you again.
Look forward to do it again, definitely.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.